Super. All right. Um, well, it's a couple of minutes over past, so I think we can get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar of 2021. I am Leslie Eccles. I'm the founder and CEO of Relish, and I'm really thrilled to have you all here tonight. I'm over in New York right now, and I know our panelists are various places across the country. I'm assuming most of the people on the call tonight know what Relish is, so I'm not going to spend time talking about that. But you might not know what our mission is. Our mission at Relish is to improve all human relationships. There's a nice lofty goal. And this was something that I undertook. I started this journey about 2.5 years ago. My background is in technology, and I did a lot of research into, well, what is cutting edge in terms of relationship science and what really makes a strong, resilient relationship. And very soon I stumbled across our three panelists this evening, Matthew, Joanne, and Scott. They're all working in academia around relationship science. They're also practicing therapists. So they've got a great blend of practical application, but also the theory behind all of it. And when I shared my vision for Relish, the three of them in particular got really excited about our goal, which is really to get people to start to think about investing in their relationship health as early as possible in their relationship. What we see is that people tend to leave it way too late to get to the marriage therapist couch. By the time they're there, they have one foot out the door, or there's been infidelity, or the relationship is simply broken beyond repair. So how can we make it easier, more accessible, more affordable, and slightly more fun for people? I still remember the time Matthew Johnson said to me, going to therapy is a little bit like going to the dentist for a lot of people. It's painful, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable, and people tend to put it off. And that's always stuck with me. You know, it's been a real passion of ours, our team, to really focus on getting people to take action early in their relationship. So before I hand it over to the panel, I'll be handing it over to the panel in a minute to introduce themselves. I want to introduce our head of coaching, Bryony Leo. Bryony is originally from Australia. She has a background in psychology, and she's going to be leading our panel discussion this evening. Bryony's a bit of a force of nature, and about 3 months ago, I said to her, you know, we're hearing anecdotally a lot of information about how COVID and lockdown and the stress of 2020 has impacted our clients' relationships. But we don't really have that kind of bird's eye view of what does this mean across the population. And Bryony, nothing daunted, said, why don't we do a survey? And she went out and recruited Amy Hubbard, our fourth panelist this evening, to help with that survey. Amy is at the University of Minnesota, and she led the research into our relationship health report. And we surveyed over 1,700 adults in long-term relationships into what impact has COVID had, and the pandemic and 2020 in general, and the stress of all of that. What impact has it had on your relationship? And some of the insights that we got from this were pretty spectacular. And some of them were depressing. Some of them were really uplifting. We've picked out 3 in particular that we're going to cover tonight. And we're going to talk about what this actually means for us and what practical steps can we take to ensure that when we all inevitably come out of the COVID period, we are in as good a shape as we possibly can be in our relationships. So that said, I'm going to, before I go on, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you have any questions, please hit the button and we'll do our best to answer them all at the end of the conversation. We do have a hard stop at half past the hour. We'll probably get kicked off of Zoom. So we're going to try and wrap up just slightly before half past. Okay. So I'm going to hand over to Joanne first. Joanne, if you could just give us a little bit of background on who you are and then pass it over to the next panelist. That would be great. Thanks.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm Joanne Davila. I'm a professor at Stony Brook University in the Department of Psychology, and I am the Associate Director of the Clinical Training Program there. My research focuses on close relationships and mental health, specifically how people's romantic relationships affect their mental health and vice versa. And I've been studying this area for many years now. I also have a private practice that focuses in part on working with couples. So this is one of my areas of expertise, and I'm really happy to be here tonight to answer some questions. I'll pass this along to Matt.
Thank you, Joanne. My name is Matt Johnson, and like Joanne, I'm a psychology professor, and I'm at Binghamton University, which is part of the State University of New York system. So I'm upstate from Leslie and Joanne, and I'm also in the psychology department. I also have been studying intimate relationships for my entire career, and really focused on what predicts discord and divorce in marriage over time. And so that's been the focus of my research generally, and some side trips from there. And so like Joanne, I'm also have a private practice that is shut down at the moment due to COVID, but looking forward to getting it back up. And I also specialize in marriage. So thanks. Scott, you want to take over for her?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm Scott Braithwaite. I'm a professor of psychology at Brigham Young University, so I'm the odd one out all the way in the West. I also study romantic relationships. I'm the director of what we call the Relationship Health Lab. The idea is just trying to find ways to promote relationship health using different models for how we dose and deliver our interventions. And that's why I think something like Relish is so great. It just is a way of trying to help relationships stay healthy on the front end waiting until they really get in trouble and then trying to put the pieces back together. I also have a private practice, which I've continued through COVID just via Zoom. And there seem to be a lot of relationship problems. I feel very busy. And so that's been, both a good and a bad thing. It's bad to see people struggling so much, but happy to do what I can to help.
Great. And do we have Amy on the line as well?
Yes, I'm here.
Great.
Hi, I'm Amy Hubbard. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Minnesota. So I'm graduating this spring and very excited about that. My research also focuses on couples and specifically how couples get to the therapy room. So really understanding that process. And I've always been really interested in early intervention. So I was really excited to get to work with Relish and help with getting this survey up and launched.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. So we're going to jump right into it because we've got a little bit to cover, and I'd love to get everyone's thoughts about kind of these themes that we saw coming through the report. So just to start with, the first thing that we thought was really interesting, and it just feels like it's very specific to last year, was basically 58% of our respondents said that the biggest impact of the past year, or it was of COVID-19, was on their mental health. And this was above financial stress, relationship stress, loneliness, isolation. So there's obviously something that's really significant going on there. And we know just from anecdotally and also from the research that, you know, our mental health and our relationship kind of go hand in hand. So I'd love to get the panel's thoughts around, first of all, just to tell us a little bit about, I guess, the theory behind that relationship between mental health and romantic relationships. And also some tips around how we can kind of protect our relationships if our mental health is struggling. So Joanne, I know that you have a bit of background in this, so maybe you could start us off.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So we know, and of course the Relish data also tell us that relationships are really central in people's lives because of the things they provide us with, things like support, companionship, a sense of feeling valued, tangible help with things, all sorts of things like that. Now, when things go wrong, we face the loss of these things, and that can lead to feelings of depression, anxiety, anger, can lead to using substances to manage our feelings. So when our relationships are threatened, that can really affect our mental health. The same is true in the other direction, right? So when we're struggling emotionally or we're struggling with, you know, behavioral or substance kinds of problems, those things impact the people around us, particularly the people that we're closest to, right? They have implications for how our partners can live their lives, how our partners can get their needs met. Our emotions demand additional resources from our partners. So it's not surprising that our mental health and what happens in our relationships would be connected for those reasons. Mm-hmm. I'm happy to chat a little bit about the next part of your question too, about how we might manage it.
I feel like our audience is really, that's something they're really interested in, which is, well, you know, maybe I'm experiencing a period of depression, which is normal given these circumstances, but how can I actually, at the very least, try to kind of at least protect the relationship or leverage the relationship in some way to be protective of mental health? So what?
Yeah. So it's really very, very challenging because when we're struggling with our own mental health, it's very hard to be available for our partners. And so we really do have to pay attention to what's happening for us. I'm going to turn that on the other side for a minute because when we see that our partner's mental health is impacting us, right? We see that through their need for extra care, right? Emotionally and practically. We see that because maybe they're withdrawing and being unavailable. It may mean that they can't work and now we're in financial trouble, right? Those kinds of things. So essentially the balance of mutuality gets thrown off in a relationship. And so one of the things that we really need to think about is how we can take care of ourselves in the face of that, right? As partners of people who are struggling with, say, depression or anxiety, we really need to focus on our own self-care. We really need to manage our emotional responses to our partners. It's very easy to get frustrated, to get angry, to tell them how we think things ought to be. We also get sad for them. So we're having a lot of emotions in response to our partner's emotions that we have to then pay attention to and make sure we're taking care of. And so it's important for us to be able to reach out and get the support we need. We're used to maybe getting it from our partners, but when our partners are struggling, they may not be able to provide us with that same support practically and emotionally. And so one of the things that's important is for us to make sure we can get that support elsewhere, right? We would like to always get everything from our partners, but even in the best of times, that isn't always practical. So really being open to figuring out how else we're going to help ourselves and get the help we need in these situations is really important. It's also really important when we're thinking about how to relate to our partners who are struggling with their emotions and with their mental health, it's really important for us not to blame or criticize our partners. We know for sure that that will make things worse. It's easy to do, right? We want to tell people just like, come on, just get out of bed, or stop whining, or, stop worrying about these things. But that is never going to help a partner. That's only going to be perceived as critical and as blaming. It's also helpful not to expect more than someone can provide when they're really struggling emotionally. It's depression, anxiety, these are truly impairing problems. And sometimes we are going to need to just give our partners some space to just go through these emotions without expectations that they can really do what they usually do. Now, of course, at the same time, we need to support our partners in getting the help that they need. And for people who are struggling, they need to recognize that it's important for them to get some assistance there, so that they're not, just going deeper down into anxiety and deeper down into depression.
Yeah, and
really important.
Sorry to interrupt, Jen. I was just thinking one thing we see, we hear of often is, that question of, my partner seems to be depressed, or they seem to not be coping, but they're not ready to get help. Like they're kind of in a spot where they just feel stuck. What would you say to somebody who presented with that issue? Because it feels like it's so common, and obviously it's a bit of a cycle where, both people's emotions feed off each other. But I imagine that's something that you must see a lot in your practice.
Yeah, no, that's extremely common. It's very hard for people to just sort of stop being depressed or stop being anxious. We know, like particularly with depression, it's very cyclical, and it can take some time for people to be literally able to do something to help themselves. And even if they are, say in therapy, for example, that just takes time. So it's really important for a partner to recognize that, to give the person some time, to, be tolerant of, accepting of what your depressed partner has to go through to sort of come out the other side of this. And that can be extremely difficult to watch and to cope with. But there's no data that would suggest that sort of telling somebody to hurry up and get better is actually going to make that happen. That's clearly going to make that worse.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Does any of the other panelists have any thoughts around that, around kind of that balance between being able to support your partner to get help but also give them enough time? Because it feels like that must be one of the biggest issues that you come across in your work.
Yeah, it's a very tricky thing. I agree with everything that Joanne said, but one finding from the research that comes to mind is people who are experiencing depression often experience problems with their marriage. And again, kind of like Joanne was saying, it's bidirectional. People who experience problems with their marriage experience depression. But in terms of treatment targets, if people receive couple therapy, that typically improves both depressive symptoms and the relationship. Whereas if they just get individual therapy for depression, that doesn't hit both domains, just their depressive symptoms improve. And so in some ways, I think one of the best things you can do is to try to strengthen that relationship. So certainly I do think that people will benefit from individual therapy, but couple therapy, like I say, seems to hit both the individual mental health problems and the couple problems. So I think it's a really smart way to try to approach this. Strengthening your relationship is good medicine for your mental health as well.
Mm-hmm.
But Scott and Joanne, don't you find that so often when you have a couple come into your practice, especially if one person is depressed, then the other person's like, okay, we're both here, like now fix him or fix her. And I think, Joanne, you kind of addressed this a little earlier, but that's not a super helpful attitude when you do go into couples therapy, and it can backfire, and I think it's worth, I think Joanne mentioned this in her initial comments, I think it's worth spending some time and making the effort to examine your own thoughts and your own feelings about your marriage, about, you know, what you're going through, as well as what your partner is going through.
I agree with that. You know, one of the key interventions in some of the couples therapies is to help the couple come together as a team to work on whatever problem they're facing, even if it appears that that is a problem of one partner. So rather than the two people sort of being on the opposite sides, like Matt was describing, like you need to fix this, if we're a team and we see a partner's, you know, depression as something that we're going to work together on, that might have a chance of being more effective for the couple.
That's great. And that kind of speaks to that whole bi-directional thing, doesn't it? It's not one or the other. It's really both of these things which are impacting relationship and mental health. And it's a nice way to think of it, that maybe, you know, 58% of people have cited mental health as a struggle, but perhaps things could have been much worse if they were in a bad relationship. So, you know, it sounds like even people in happy relationships might still encounter mental health issues at times, but they might not necessarily be as impactful as if, you know, their partner wasn't supportive. That's great. Thank you, everyone. We need to move on to our next theme, because I really want to hear a little bit more about this. And this is another thing that comes up really regularly with our coaching clients, which is, so the finding was that in the survey, the impact of COVID and COVID-related changes seem to be particularly prominent for working mothers. So actually, of our respondents, 41% of women described either having quit their jobs, considered quitting their jobs, or asked for less responsibility at work as a result of that kind of juggle between childcare, work, home chores, that sort of thing. We also found strong links between satisfaction with the division of labour at home, so chores, childcare, that sort of thing, with mental health and also relationship satisfaction, which I believe is a link that's already been established in the literature, which is that it's not just about being, you know, harmonious at home, it's also about mental health and about how close you feel to your partner. So Amy, I'd love to get your thoughts about this, because I know you've got some background in this. I think our audience would love to know what are some recommendations you have about how to approach fairness at home. So if we can assume that women have been disproportionately impacted by this, particularly working mothers, what are some tips for people who might be wanting to have that conversation or wanting to kind of address an imbalance that's gotten a lot more intense in the last year?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that comes up quite a bit in the literature around division of labor and the household is that perceived fairness is a big factor. So that idea that if it feels fair, that means a lot. And so that's something I think about a lot in terms of when I work with couples in my own practice, is how does it feel? Because even if it is 50-50, if somebody feels more burdened, that's important to understand and better articulate where that's coming from, because maybe it's mental health and there can be all these other factors that are involved in it. And then also perceived spousal support is really important. So that idea that if I'm taking on more, then I maybe feel that support from my partner. And that's, I think, also really helpful to just, because having that support is important. And along those same lines, I talk about this a lot as a clinician, but just having really important conversations with your partner, like saying, like, I'm really maxed and I can only do like 30%. I can only go 30 today. I'm gonna need you to come 70. And if there's a gap, what's the plan for addressing it when you guys are in a gap? Because if you can only go 30 and I can only go 30, that leaves a little bit of place we need to address. And so having those plans in place ahead of time can be really valuable in terms of reducing conflict and feeling more, like Joanna said, being on the same team about something versus feeling like it's a me versus you issue.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So it sounds like it's about the perception. So there's, you know, maybe a totally equal relationship isn't always possible, but it's more about kind of having that conversation or you know, at least kind of acknowledging the other person is putting in disproportionately more. Do the other panelists have anything to comment about this? Like when you saw these findings, was it surprising to you? Was it something you've seen in your practice that maybe this is something that couples are coming to therapy with as their major complaint?
I'll just jump in really quickly and just say, you know, Amy's absolutely right. It's about perception, but perception is a tricky thing. So, you know, one of the things that that the literature also shows is that if you can find ways of supporting your partner that A, they really want, and B, that they haven't asked for and don't even necessarily know about, that can be incredibly effective. There's some, you know, interesting research about how it can be beneficial when your partner can't even articulate the ways in which you've supported them, and paradoxically, in those couples where they struggle to talk about how their partner supports them and the concrete ways in which they support them, some of those couples actually do better, have more satisfying relationships. So support can be a tricky thing, and Joanne's written and thought about this, I think, a lot more than I have, but it certainly is something that you want to be careful with and not give it where it's not wanted, and you do want to give it where it is wanted, and you don't want to make a big deal about it. Joanne, am I anywhere close to what you've written about this?
Yeah, you're completely close. I mean, the data really show that support is no good if it's not what the other partner wants. And so, you know, figuring out what that is and giving what they want, even if it's not what you would naturally give, is pretty important.
I think this finding for me was one of the more shocking ones, and I wonder about what this means in terms of build-up of resentment if women are disproportionately being forced to give up their careers, give up their jobs. Are we going to see this kind of build-up of resentment over the next 6 months, 12 months? And are we setting back, are we setting back this generation in terms of our gender, and taking a step backwards in that sort of gender equity and gender parity? I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that or has spent time thinking about it. But I would worry that this means that there's a lot of women who are really resentful about the current situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this has deepened something that's been around for a while. So if, you look at the research on heterosexual couples, when both partners work, women still do a disproportionate share of all of the housework, right? Usually it's twice as much. And that's not because they have more bandwidth. It's simply because that's just kind of how it is. I worry that the pandemic could have deepened that just because there's a lot of other things going on. People are having to maybe teach kids, at home where they're not able to go to school. And I think we just have to be really careful to be intentional, that we chart a course that both partners are going to be happy with. Because I think the de facto status quo is that women have to carry a disproportionate burden. And like you can see in these data, it takes a toll. It makes it so oftentimes they're more likely to walk away from a career. I don't think it has to be that way, but I think if we don't have those conversations, it seems to be the default setting. Even though we've made a lot of progress with gender equity in many domains, this is one where we still have a lot of room to grow, I think.
Have you seen the data there's some anecdotal reporting out of Japan and Korea. This is my citation here is the New York Times, but where the gender disparity in childcare and housework is much greater than the US, and that it looks like that the lockdown, the COVID pandemic may actually be leading to more equity in the house, because men are working from home and seeing how much the women are doing, and the women are seeing how little the men are doing in their jobs. And so again, this is all anecdotal, but you know, there might be some interesting results from the pandemic that don't go the way you would necessarily predict.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Matthew. I have also heard that anecdotally through at the end of the survey, we offered a free form text field, which is incredibly illuminating. But again, it's all kind of anecdotal. But the being so cooped up together has meant that people are gaining an insight into the other person's life that they wouldn't have had otherwise, for better or for worse. But certainly the veil has been removed somewhat, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, that it's a lot harder to kind of do the gatekeeping thing of I did more than you or I did more than you, because you're basically together all day. So it's very clear. I think one of the quotes from the survey was, yeah, I actually now have a new understanding of actually how busy my wife is during the day with the kids. Like it's absolute chaos. So that's really interesting. Thanks for your input, everyone. That's it feels like this is something that we are going to be dealing with for at least the next few years in terms of the shifts. It sounds like it was already an issue, and now it's really deepened. So the next theme I wanted to touch on is a really interesting one, and we were very surprised to find this, given all the anecdotal things we'd heard about stress and relationships. But essentially, when we asked people about their happiness in their relationship, 41% of people said that they're happier now as opposed to pre-COVID. So obviously we didn't ask them before COVID, but they perceive themselves in their relationship to be happier. And when we kind of dug a little bit deeper, it looked like these weren't just kind of the idyllic, happy couples with absolutely no problem. They had actually probably gone through a whole lot together, but there was something that happened, within the last year that actually push them a bit closer together or help them to kind of deepen their relationship. So Matt, I'd love to get your insight on this, because it sounds like you've got some background information on this, but what does the literature tell us about these couples who seem to be able to come through really difficult, stressful times stronger? What differentiates those from the couples that we know broke up during COVID and who sort of had that pressure cooker moment? Can you give us a bit of an insight into that?
Sure. What the chart that you have up there, what it really reminded me of was a study that some colleagues and I did where we, really tried to help couples do what Relish is doing, kind of prevent problems from developing. And what we found, one of the things that we found was that it didn't matter so much what specific skill we were trying to teach them, but what seemed to help was just the couple being together, focusing on a shared task. In the case of our lab experiment, it was watching a movie together and then talking about how that movie impacted their relationship or reminded them of their relationship. And that reminds me of, the biggest chunk in your pie chart there is quality time together. And so I wonder if, one of the ways in which all of us being cooped up together will change relationships is for those couples who are able to spend that time in a quality way, focused on each other and attending to their relationship, attending to each other, may deepen some relationships that exist out there and could have the potential to deepen the connections that we have.
Mm-hmm. And is this couples who, because I imagine when I was reading that chart, I was thinking it would be really difficult to spend quality time together if you're not actually getting along with your partner. So if you're having, a crisis or you're not, you're annoying each other. Is there something that these, I guess I'd call them like resilient couples do? Do they just kind of suck it up and spend time together? Or is there a special way of negotiating, you know, how to, I guess, focus on the relationship, even if you are both cranky or overtired or that sort of thing?
Well, I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists think as well. I mean, my sense is that it really is, you know, sort of just shared activities, you know, where they shared, especially if they're kind of novel activities. If, you know, they're picking up the same hobbies now, or if they're both, you know, now doing paint by numbers, or they're both taking walks in the woods every day, or whatever it is, those kind of novel shared activities in which they really can attend to each other in the relationship might be really the things that help. But that's my thought. You know, that's how I'm trying to apply some of the research I know about. I'd be interested in what others think.
Yeah, I guess as I consider it, you know, it's going to depend, because some couples will do really well to just have lots and lots of time together. Others, they'll start to drive each other crazy. And so I think sometimes it just depends on that couple. I do think that just as a general principle, that trying to be intentional when it comes to making sure that you have time for connection, time for the relationship, right? That couples who do really well over time tend not to just think, okay, you know, my marriage will take care of itself and I'll get busy doing other things, but they'll really intentionally invest in their relationship over time. And so I think that trying to have, you know, some planned time to connect, you know, whether that's to do some sort of put the kids to bed and have a date down on the couch, you know, or something like that, where we don't just let time become this diffuse thing that we're not really making good use of, but that at least some of it is targeted toward trying to build and foster those connections in ways, like Matthew was saying, just trying to do novel things together, trying to connect in ways that are going to be slightly different for everyone. I guess I'm just saying, I don't think that just happens. I think people kind of have to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting, because I think just from, again, reading the comments, it does sound like the couples that describe themselves as the happiest or as the most contented, they had kind of, yeah, made that commitment. They'd intentionally used Relish. They'd intentionally sort of made date nights. And again, I can imagine it's hard to be intentional if you sort of have one foot out the door. So it sounds like it's a bit of a combination around the investment in the relationship and also the quality of the relationship.
That's right. I mean, you know, a stressor like COVID is, or any other stressors, you know, there's an old saying that, you know, in the forest, all the trees look the same. Only storm can tell the weak trees from the strong trees, and only a storm will knock down the weak trees. And so, you know, stressful events, you know, can exacerbate problems that are there in couples already, but they can also strengthen relationships as well. That's, you know, that's one of the findings that we've seen repeatedly in the marriage research, that's the case. And so, yeah, I think that's worth being aware of that. If you were having some struggles with your relationship even before the pandemic, it's, you know, perfectly reasonable that you would have some of those problems exacerbated. And so I think it's okay to understand that. So, yeah.
That's great.
Matthew, how do you think about, or maybe one of the other panelists, how do you think about striking the balance between, because we get a lot of couples who they talk their issue to death, shall we say. There's an issue and they talk about it, or one of them wants to talk about it and the other one doesn't. How do you balance that? Because there's a sort of theory that says, well, stop talking about the issue and just focus on connecting and having fun and doing these novel things together. But how do you balance that against just brushing the issue under the carpet and ignoring it, which also isn't healthy? How do you get that balance right? That's maybe a hard question to answer.
Well, that's, you know, honestly, one of the ways that couples therapy can really be handy is so often when I'm doing couples therapy, I'll say, okay, this is your hour a week that we're going to really talk about this. And the rest of the time, you're able to not talk about it, that you get to give yourself a break from having to discuss it. That doesn't work for every issue or every couple, but I just want to be clear, you know, but and you don't need to pay a therapist necessarily to do that. You can do that yourself, you know, you can, you know, set aside certain times that we'll talk about it and maybe let it go at other times. But that varies very much by what the issue is. I don't know. I'd be interested in what Amy and Joanne and Scott think.
One thought I have is that it's important to consider why it is that a member of the couple feels the need that something has to be talked about more and more. There could be reasons that have to do with, say, that individual's anxiety that just drives them to want to talk about it. But it could actually be a reflection of the fact that nothing is being done. Nothing's being worked on, no steps are being taken. And if that's the case, then it is more likely that someone or both members are trying to sort of brush it under the rug, and that's not going to be healthy for the relationship. So I think it is hard for couples to figure this out on their own, right? How much of this is something we just need to let go of and not get so, you know, worked up about versus something that we're just ignoring something that needs to change.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, sorry, please.
I was gonna say, I think it is a very good point that it's really hard to kind of always know which way it goes. And one thing I often think about is how often are we arguing about logistics and kind of up high things versus being able to be vulnerable and say, this is what I really am wanting or needing, because that's very scary and has a high risk associated with. And so there are times when, you know, as the idea goes, like, you're not fighting about the dishes, you're fighting about something else. And so if when couples are able to kind of talk about the underlying motivation or reason for things, that can also be helpful. But there can be also a variety of other things, as others have outlined, that can make that harder. So, as a caveat.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes just having the same conversation over and over again means that you're not talking about the real issue. The real issue is somewhere under the surface. And sometimes getting help can help you to get to that more quickly. But I think trying to really get at kind of that deeper level where we're talking about our emotions and the things that are harder to talk about often help to unearth that. The other possibility is that sometimes you have a problem that's solvable, but a lot of research suggests that many problems are not solvable, in that you can just reach a consensus and move forward, but they have to do with fundamental differences between partners. And those problems need to be handled a little bit differently. So that's where I think sometimes getting a little bit of help can be helpful if you're getting stuck in that pattern.
That's great. Thank you, everyone. That's so interesting. And it sounds like, again, it's that kind of that self-awareness and that intentionality of actually acknowledging there's a problem or there's an issue, and, you know, there's several ways of managing it, whether that's adjusting our expectations or kind of getting to the root cause. I wanted to throw it back over to Leslie now, because we are at this, well, we don't have time for that today, but we're at the stage of the webinar where we have a discussion. So anyone who's sent through questions to the Q&A section, you can do that now if you'd like. Leslie's been connecting or collecting Q&A. So I'll throw it over to her to see if we have any questions from the audience.
Yeah, we have a question here from Deb. What we talked earlier about things that are unsolvable. I think, Scott, it was you that mentioned that. What's an example of something unsolvable, and what can you do about that if you're in that situation?
I'd really like to hear what others think, but I'll give you just an example from my work with couples. If you say we're talking about money or budgeting, that seems to be something that's pretty amenable to problem solving, because you can sort of say, oh, well, we overspent, let's come up with a plan for how we're going to fix that. Something that's more likely to be unsolvable is if one person is just fundamentally more extroverted and sociable than the other person. And so one person's like, I really want to be out and about and talking and busy and doing things. The other person's like, I'd really just like to hunker down and watch a movie, right? And that can be a small thing, but over time it can start to make them feel like, how do we, bridge this gap between us? And I don't think that fundamental personality trait of one person being much more extroverted than the other is likely to change. Like, you're not going to fix, and I don't even know that a person needs to be fixed. It's a difference. It's not a deficit. It's not a problem. So in that situation, I think you just need to figure out ways to make sure that difference doesn't compound and create issues. And sometimes it's how you talk about it and how you approach that problem, not so much with the goal of trying to fix or blame or whatever the other person, but to make sure that difference doesn't create tension and rifts in the relationship. So that might be an example, but I'd love to hear other people's comments on that too.
May I just offer an example of the quintessential unsolvable problem in my mind is when violence is being used to control a partner. I just want to throw that out there. I feel like anytime we talk about intimate relationships, unfortunately, we do need to mention violence. And so if you find yourself in a relationship that is violent and with a partner who is using that violence to control you, so that it's kind of a violence that pops out of nowhere, or it's about controlling you, as opposed to violence that might, just escalate out of an argument and that sort of kind of violence, then I tend to view that as a relatively unsolvable problem as a couple. And I think that's where, you might want to think about making yourself unavailable to your partner, if you are a victim of violence.
That's a good point, Matthew. Joanne, do you have anything you want to add, or Amy?
No, I think those are the key points.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I would agree.
We've got another question here from Claire. How do you get to the heart of the problem when each person in the couple disagrees about what the problem actually is? How do you cope with that situation? Or maybe give us an example of what that might look like. Have you ever come across a situation where a couple is disagreeing about what the problem is? And this might go back to the point of, fix that person. How do you get to the heart of that issue?
I think there's a couple ways to answer this question. I'll offer one, and it relates to what you said, Leslie, in terms of it going back to this, you need to be fixed. No, you need to be fixed, right? That blaming position that couples often take. And it relates to, I think, what Amy said earlier and some others, which is that sometimes being able to look deeply at yourself and be open and vulnerable around what you're really struggling with, and being able to share that with your partner can be helpful, because couples often polarize, or partners often polarize around things when they're feeling hurt, scared, afraid, some sort of vulnerable emotion in that kind of way. Now, that's really hard to do in that circumstance, especially on your own, because why would you want to take the risk to show yourself in that way when you've got a hostile partner, or what appears to be a hostile partner? But if couples can move to that, make that shift, they often can start to soften up and start to see what's really going on for each of them at a different level, that moves them away from this idea that what one sees as the problem really isn't the problem at all.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. The way that I frame it is that we often come into a problem with what I would call a simple story. And that simple story often, like everybody has said, blames the partner. Someone is kind of saying, I feel this emotional pain and I'm trying to make sense of it. Hey, I think it's you. I think you're the one who's making me miserable. And if you would just change this thing, suddenly our relationship would work. And then all of their efforts to improve the relationship focus on trying to change their partner, which, shocker, doesn't make the other person very happy and tends to create a cycle of problems. So I think trying to complicate the narrative, trying to actually become more realistic about what's going on, considering all of the different factors that are likely playing into that situation, and coming up with a realization that we're doing this dance together, and the way that we're doing it, the steps are causing us to hurt each other. But you're not the enemy, and I'm not the enemy. The problem is the enemy, and we want to kind of align together against the problem. And again, I think that having an outside set of eyes sometimes can be helpful with that.
Yeah, I love that anecdote, Scott. That's great. The next question that we have is to do with past relationships. This is a question from Bridget. And it's really about how much of your past relationship is pertinent to your current relationship. And I guess it's about bringing the hurt and the trauma and the problems from your previous relationship, and how do you recover from that and not let it impact your new relationship?
The first thing that came to my mind is I work with Bill Doherty here at the University of Minnesota, and he always talks about, he does a lot, great clinician and researcher, and talks a lot about the idea that you can't divorce yourself. So this is a relationship that you take in with you to every future relationship. And so the importance of, when you know you've had a really bad relationship end, or you've had all this trauma or all these other just kind of bad experiences, the importance of caring for that and caring for you, so that you can bring your best self forward into your next relationship.
And so, Amy, would you say that doing individual therapy would be helpful there, or would it be more working together as a couple on the new relationship?
Well, I'm a couples therapist, so I feel like I'm very biased and tend to recommend a lot of couples work, because as I think it was Scott said earlier, like, we know that it's really effective at addressing a variety of issues, individual and relational issues. But that can depend if part of the stuff that you're trying to work through is not trusting people or not trusting your partner. It might be really hard to get to the depth that you need in a couple session, and so you may need to kind of start with individual therapy and kind of work up, especially if you feel like your individual stuff is like the Joanna talked about earlier, depression, anxiety, all of those things show up in our relationship. So it can be helpful to do couples work if you feel like it's impacting your relationship as well. So yeah. I feel like that's not a very good answer, because it's everything. Yeah.
Conscious of time, we have about 5 minutes left. We have a question about a narcissistic partner. How do you manage working with a narcissistic partner who doesn't actually know that they're a narcissist? And I feel like this comes up a lot with many of our coaching clients in Relish, when the other person is apparently or allegedly not aware of their narcissism. Is that something that you've experienced in your practice? Can any of you talk to this?
It's extremely difficult. I think the part about alleged versus actually is important, because sometimes people can view a partner that way when that's not necessarily the reality. But there are many instances, certainly, where it is the reality. And when it is the reality, that's it's very hard in that situation, because the relationship needs to be based on mutuality and all the things we've been talking about today about coming together. And if one partner is truly narcissistic, that is out of their repertoire typically. So not to be pessimistic, but I think that's a situation where understanding who you're in a relationship with is necessary, and then making a decision about if that person is not willing to see that or do anything to work on that or change that, thinking about whether that's something you can live with in a relationship or not.
Does anyone have anything else to add there? Scott, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that again, if they've been diagnosed, I think individual treatment is likely to be your best option. It's really hard to have a strong, thriving relationship unless both people have a certain kind of basic level of insight, awareness, ability to stand on their own 2 feet before they try to work together as a couple. And so that can be really hard to do. I can just see in the chat kind of saying, how do you do that when they don't know or accept that they're narcissistic? That is the vicious part of narcissism, right? Is that you have an inability to see those problems and how they affect the people around you. So I agree with Joanne that these are tough situations. It's something where I think getting help, it becomes really important, but I think that help probably is best started as an individual before you try to combine and strengthen your relationship. And I think that can be helpful for both of you, because oftentimes people in those relationships need a lot of help and support because they're carrying a heavy load.
So individual help, individual therapy, or counseling for the partner of the narcissist to help them navigate this effectively.
But also for the individual to help them navigate how they can, whether they want to and can they be in this relationship.
Right.
And to and one way to help them understand how they might seek help on their own is you can empathize with them and say, wouldn't it be hard, to give yourself empathy for someone who's narcissistic? You can think to yourself, boy, wouldn't it be hard to have to be the most attractive person, the smartest person, and the best person in every room you walked into? That would be really hard. And so that might help give you some sympathy for the person with narcissism that you live with.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, guys. This has been a fascinating conversation. Bryony, do you have anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No, just thanks to everyone for their fantastic contributions. I feel like I've learned so much today. I'm glad. We've recorded this webinar, so we'll send the people who've attended a copy of the report, and the webinar should be available at some point to watch again if you'd like. I feel like there's a lot of really, really important information in there.
Great. Thank you to everyone on the panel. Thank you to everyone for showing up, and look out for the email with the copy of the report. Should be coming through tomorrow, and email us or reach out on Instagram if you want to chat. We're always around for a good chat on any of this stuff. Yeah, thanks again, panel. This has been fun, and hopefully we'll do it again soon. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.